A chilling rustle echoed from the birch thicket ahead. Under the pale moonlight, a fully grown male Bengal tiger, weighing easily over 500 pounds, slowly emerged. He stretched his thick neck, sniffing the air, his glowing amber eyes locked onto my bleeding leg. The solid steel bear trap had bitten deep into my calf over an hour ago, the blood flowing and mixing with the cold night mist to create a pungent metallic scent. A death invitation in the heart of the Blackwood Wildlife Reserve. My radio was smashed to pieces. I was completely alone. Death was breathing down my neck. In a forest filled with beasts whose wild instincts had been reawakened, I was no longer a ranger. I was desperate prey. I gritted my teeth and drew the revolver from my hip, my hand trembling with cold sweat, closed my eyes, and whispered one final prayer. But there was no pounce. No throat-tearing roar. Instead, a blast of scorching breath hit my face. A rough tongue gently licked my cheek, wiping away the streak of cold sweat. I snapped my eyes open, the gun still in my hand but awkwardly going slack. The massive nose was sniffing right at my neck, and those ferocious eyes now gleamed with a heartbreakingly familiar light. My throat was dry, forcing out a choked sob. "Is that you, Samson?" The giant monster didn't answer. He only let out a low, deep purr in his chest, then rubbed his massive head, as wide as a man's embrace, against my chest. A gesture filled with bizarrely comforting warmth. Then he whipped around. Instead of tearing me apart, Samson slowly lowered his center of gravity, lying flat on his stomach right next to my trapped leg. He stretched out his muscular front paws, facing straight into the pitch-black forest. He bared his fangs, letting out a series of menacing growls into the darkness. Any creature eyeing this scent of blood would have to step over his dead body. The forest's most ruthless predator had turned himself into my sentinel. Leaning against a rotting tree trunk, looking at the sturdy striped back shielding me from death, the pain in my legs seemed to fade. Memories carried me back in time to 4 years ago. 4 years ago, I wasn't a proud ranger with a gleaming badge on my left chest. I was just an empty shell. Sleepless, sweat-drenched nights where the steady hum of the ceiling fan twisted in my ears into the deafening roar of Black Hawk helicopter blades, and the metallic stench of blood and gunpowder haunted every breath. The psychiatrist said I had severe PTSD after my final tour in the deadly valleys of Kandahar. I fled the human world, begging for the lowliest stall-cleaning job at this Blackwood sanctuary, just to lock myself away and not have to interact with anyone. Until a bitterly cold winter morning, when the local sheriff brought in a cardboard box confiscated from an exotic animal smuggling ring. Inside was a tiny, filthy, striped furball. He was barely breathing, severely malnourished, his eyes glued shut with infected mucus. The sanctuary director shook his head sympathetically, saying the animal was too weak. He wouldn't make it through the night. But looking at that emaciated chest rising and falling in sheer desperation, I saw myself, a broken soul abandoned by the world, struggling on the edge of death. I volunteered for the night shift. With a small syringe, I patiently fed drops of warm formula into that weak, freezing mouth. I stayed awake for 3 straight nights, terrified to close my eyes for fear the little creature would stop breathing. On the 4th night, when my panic attack suddenly hit, leaving me suffocating and curled up trembling in the corner of the clinic, that little furball painstakingly dragged himself over. He buried his head between my arms and curled up, his steady, warm heartbeat and tiny life force transmitting through my frayed shirt miraculously silenced the deafening gunshots in my head. I named him Samson. He was the sanctuary's patient, but in truth, he was my therapist. Samson grew incredibly fast. From a sickly animal, he transformed into a true king of the jungle. Our bond was unbreakable. But a massive Bengal tiger is never a pet. The day the director decided to release Samson into the reserve's thousands of acres of semi-wild enclosure so he could reclaim his primal instincts, my heart felt like it was being crushed. From the day that iron gate closed, for 2 long years, I only dared to watch him from afar through binoculars. I fought to give him back his freedom, and forced myself to be cold to protect him from trusting humans too much, a fatal flaw that could kill him in the wild. A biting wind whipped through the valley, yanking me back to the cruel reality. Blood was still seeping from the wound on my swelling calf. Samson flicked his ears. His thick fur brushed against my shoulder, transmitting a familiar warmth that chased away the bitter chill. He let out another low growl, sharp as a razor, warning off the glowing green eyes of a cunning coyote prowling nearby, lured by the scent of fresh blood. The one who once needed me to save his life, the one I forced to become wild by abandoning him, was now using that very wildness to be my only living shield in this dark night. But the fog was descending, growing thicker by the minute, and my body began to shiver from blood loss and thermal shock. I knew this protection wouldn't last if the rescue team didn't find me. Or worse, a chilling thought flashed through my mind. If they did show up and saw a giant predator standing right over the bloodied body of a ranger, what would they do? The endless dark night dragged on in agony and freezing cold. When the first dim rays of dawn pierced through the dense fog, I was completely exhausted. My vision narrowed into a blurry tunnel. The blood had stopped flowing in a stream, but my right leg had lost all sensation, cold as a block of ice. Beside me, Samson was still wide awake. His posture hadn't changed, as steady as a sandstone statue, guarding me from the phantoms of the old forest. Suddenly, my ears caught a distant sound. A mechanical whining tore through the tranquility of nature, a TV engines, followed by the rapid, sharp barking of tracking dogs catching the scent. The patrol team had found me. A spark of hope flared in my delirious mind, but it was instantly extinguished by sheer terror. Crashing through the trampled birch bushes, 2 ATVs slammed on their brakes, skidding across the loamy soil. Leading them was Sarah, the reserve's medical and rapid response captain, along with 3 other fully armed rangers. They hurriedly jumped off their vehicles, eyes darting around, searching, and then froze. They all turned to stone. From their perspective, the picture laid out was bloody and nightmarish. A comrade lying motionless, deathly pale in a pool of blood, and towering right over his body was a massive Bengal tiger, bearing 3-inch fangs and growling ferociously. In their eyes, Samson wasn't a guardian angel. He was a predator guarding his prize. "Fall back! Everyone, fall back! Weapons ready!" Sarah's voice rang out shrill, laced with a panic rare for someone so experienced. Clack! Clack! The sound of Remington rifles being chambered echoed chillingly. Wildlife Reserve Safety Protocol Number 1. When human life is directly threatened by a predator, tranquilizer guns are useless because the drug takes up to 15 minutes to affect the nervous system. In those 15 minutes, a tiger could tear a human into hundreds of pieces. Live ammunition is the only option. Sensing the threat from the black muzzles pointed straight at him, Samson's wild survival instincts erupted. He reared up completely, standing tall to shield my entire body. His ears pinned flat against the back of his head, muscles rippling under his taut skin. A deafening roar tore out, shaking the very ground beneath my back. He arched his body, poised to lunge and tear apart anyone who dared take another step. "Aim for the head. If it lunges, put it down immediately," a young ranger shouted, forehead drenched in sweat, his finger already tight against the trigger. "No," I wanted to scream, wanted to yell in their faces to drop their guns, that this giant creature had just used its own warmth to save me from freezing to death. But my throat was parched, thick with the taste of blood. The only sound that escaped was a raspy, broken groan, drowned out by the savage roaring of the tiger and the frantic barking of the canines. A bloody tragedy was seconds away. My team would blow Samson's skull apart, or Samson would lunge and snap my teammates' necks. My life, and the life of the only creature that had ever saved my shattered soul, hung by a fragile, invisible thread about to snap. I had to do something, right now, or everyone was going to die. The last ounce of strength in my body flared up, Not from my muscles, but from an instinct even deeper than survival, the desperate need to protect. I bit my lip until it bled, swallowed back a choked scream, and braced myself to drag my upper body up from the damp mud. The metal of the bear trap ground against my shin bone again, sending a neurological shockwave straight to my brain, but I ignored it. My bloody hand trembled as I reached out into the air, toward the massive, furiously rippling mass of muscle shielding me above. "Samson!" The sound that escaped my throat was hoarse, as frail as crumbling dry leaves, but in that life-or-death moment, it carried the weight of 1,000 pounds. "No, stay, easy, boy." It was the familiar phrase I had whispered into his ear countless times in that cramped clinic room 4 years ago, whenever he startled awake from the nightmares of an abused cub. As if by some invisible miracle, the earth-shattering roar died abruptly in the tiger's throat. Samson whipped his massive head around. Those amber eyes, burning with the wildfire of a bloodthirsty beast, locked straight onto me. In a fleeting fraction of a second, I saw a violent storm raging within those eyes. Survival instincts, the urge to protect his territory and prey, were violently clashing with the memory of the warmth of a surrogate father who had once fed him drop by drop. My mud and blood-stained hand finally touched the searing hot, striped fur on his flank. I slid my fingers up to Samson's nape, finding the exact hollow behind his ear, the most vulnerable spot he only ever let one person touch. I stroked him, channeling all my remaining reassurance and love through my violently shaking fingertips. The giant monster shivered slightly. He blinked. The wildness in his pupils contracted, giving way to a pitiful confusion. I turned my head, focusing the last fading light in my vision straight into Sarah's eyes. She was aiming down the sights, her cheek pressed against the stock of the Remington, her index finger halfway squeezed on the trigger. If I were a second slower, Samson's head would have exploded. "Lower the gun, Sarah. Please." I couldn't speak the words, but I knew what the eyes of a dying soldier could convey. I looked at her, then back at my hand resting on the beast's neck. A silent guarantee. A gamble with my own life. The tension in the valley was so thick you could cut it with a knife. It went against every ranger safety protocol. Lowering weapons in front of an agitated predator was suicide. But Sarah had stood by my side long enough to understand my scars, and she was also the one who watched me raise this creature. I saw Sarah swallow hard. She gritted her teeth, then slowly, very slowly, raised her left fist high. "Hold fire. Stand down. Nice and slow." Her voice was shaking but clear. 3 black muzzles reluctantly lowered toward the muddy ground. The tracking dogs also fell silent at their handlers' commands. Sensing the killing intent dissipate, Samson huffed quietly. He lowered his head, rubbing his giant wet nose against my chest one last time, letting out a soft, purring whine like an oversized house cat. Then, with a quiet majesty, he sauntered 3 steps back. He tucked his front paws in, sitting on the dew-soaked grass, returning to being a tranquil sandstone statue. His amber eyes remained wide open, never leaving Sarah's team for even a millisecond, but his fangs and claws were completely hidden away. He had trusted me. The apex predator had accepted the suppression of his wild instincts to make way for strangers to save his master's life. Jesus Christ! A young ranger let out a breath, his legs wobbling as if about to collapse. Sarah didn't hesitate for another split second. She tossed her rifle aside, grabbed the emergency med kit and the heavy-duty bolt cutters, and sprinted madly toward me. "Stay with me, Elias! I'm here! I'm right here!" All the sounds around me began to distort and muffle. Sarah screaming orders, the thud of heavy boots, the clanking of metal. I only felt the 2 freezing steel jaws of the cutters slipping between the serrated teeth embedded in my flesh. 1, 2, 3, cut! Snap! The sound of rusted steel snapping echoed sharply. The massive pressure on my calf was suddenly released, triggering a tsunami of the most agonizing pain shooting straight to my brain. My vision spun into a blinding white fog. The final image seared into my retinas before the darkness swallowed everything was that giant striped silhouette still sitting silently in the distance, standing guard steadfastly until my eyes closed completely. The rhythmic, soulless beeping of an EKG monitor was the first thing to pull me up from the swamp of unconsciousness. The pungent smell of mud, blood, and the bone-chilling cold of the forest were gone, replaced by the chillingly sterile scent of antiseptic in the county hospital. My right calf was encased in a rigid cast, suspended on a pulley system. Under the pale fluorescent lights, I saw Sarah dozing with her head resting on the edge of the bed, her ranger uniform still stained with dried mud from that night. Hearing me stir, she startled awake, her dark circled eyes instantly lighting up with a relieved smile. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Elias," Sarah breathed a sigh of relief, pouring me a cup of warm water. Seeing my eyes still dazed, carrying that inherent panic searching for a familiar striped silhouette, she cleared her throat, her smile becoming gentle and filled with awe. "You owe that big cat a life, buddy. No, 2 lives actually. Yours, and my entire team's." Sarah softly touched my hand. "You know, when the medevac chopper blades tore through the valley to hoist you up, that sound was enough to drive any wild beast crazy with terror. But Samson, he didn't run and he didn't attack. He just quietly backed away, blending into the birch trees, and stood there like a statue. His amber eyes tracked you until your basket was hoisted to safety and disappeared from the sky." My eyes stung. My throat choked up, unable to speak a word. That wild giant had broken every rule of nature just to make sure I was safe. 6 months later, the autumn wind carried the biting chill typical of the high mountains, sending bright red maple leaves swirling along the familiar trail. Leaning on an aluminum crutch, I dragged my right leg, still undergoing physical therapy, slowly approaching the boundary of Sector 4, the human-isolated, semi-wild zone of the Blackwood Reserve. Stopping in front of the heavy-duty industrial chain-link fence, standing dozens of feet high, I took a deep breath of the pine resin and morning dew. It was dead silent all around. I cupped my hands over my mouth and whistled. A short 3-note melody I used to use to call that hungry little tiger cub back in the day. The melody echoed across the vast valley, then faded into the void. 1 minute, then 2 minutes passed. Just as I thought his wild instincts had completely taken over and wiped away his memory of me, the distant brush began to rustle. From the dense vegetation, a majestic silhouette with regal stripes, glowing under the morning sun, sauntered out. Samson. He seemed even larger and more powerful than on that terrifying night 6 months ago. The absolute ruler of the forest took proud, silent strides across the grass, heading straight for me. He stopped right at the steel fence. His deep amber eyes stared intently at my crutch and my limping leg. There was no threatening roar, no wariness of a wild beast. He let out a chuff, that signature greeting sound, vibrating with pure friendliness from his chest. Then, he lowered his massive head, squeezed his eyes shut, and pressed his nape right against the spot where my hand rested on the chain link. The heat from his body radiated through the freezing metal mesh. I smiled, pressed my forehead against the fence, and closed my eyes to soak in this moment of absolute peace. The physical boundary between man and beast was separated by a chain-link fence, but the boundary of the soul had been erased long ago. They often say that when you return from a bloody war, the psychological ghosts and PTSD will strip away a piece of your soul. They leave you constantly on guard, forever fearful, unable to ever trust another human being in this world again. They are right. That illness once turned me into a broken man, resentful of my own kind. But there's one thing the psychiatrists never told me. That sometimes absolute trust, unconditional loyalty, and the greatest inherent goodness don't come from a human. They can come from the wildest, most dangerous, and most instinct-driven creature Mother Nature ever created. That day in the freezing corner of the woods, Samson didn't just use his body as a shield to protect my frail flesh from death. With his savage love and undying loyalty, he salvaged and protected the very last shred of humanity left inside me. Thanks to that giant sentinel, I was finally, truly, allowed to live as a human being once again.